Hey everyone, glad to have you here. If this is your first time, don't forget to subscribe. It helps me bring you more stories like this. Now get comfortable, it's time to dive into the story White House Under Siege, Secret Service versus Zombie Apocalypse. Let's start the story. I'm writing this because I need people to know what really happened in D.C. during those first days. My name is Agent Nathan Benson, and when the infection breached the inner perimeter, my last order was clear: protect the president at all costs. We evacuated him in the final moments, but I stayed behind. The nuclear strike hit at 03:47 hours on October 15th. I know the exact time because that's when every clock in the White House stopped. I woke up buried under chunks of plaster and twisted metal beams in what used to be the West Wing corridor. My ears rang like church bells, blood trickling from my nose onto the debris-covered carpet I'd walked across thousands of times. The smell hit me first. Acrid smoke mixed with something metallic and wrong. Dust particles danced in shafts of orange light filtering through massive holes in the ceiling. I could taste radiation on my tongue, a bitter coating that made my saliva thick. My left shoulder screamed when I pushed myself up, but nothing felt broken. The hallway stretched before me like a bombed-out cave. Portrait frames hung crooked, their glass shattered across the floor. The presidential seal embedded in the carpet was split down the middle. Half of it buried under collapsed drywall. Water dripped steadily from burst pipes above, each drop echoing in the unnatural silence. I checked my watch. 11:27 hours, 8 hours unconscious. My service weapon was still holstered, covered in dust but functional. The radio clipped to my vest produced only static when I tried raising command. Standard protocol kicked in: secure the area, establish communication, wait, extraction. The Oval Office door hung off its hinges, revealing a tomb of rubble where the president's desk once stood. The famous windows were blown out completely, letting in the grey morning light and the distant sound of crackling fires. I picked my way through the debris, salvaging what I could: a bottle of water from the mini-fridge, energy bars from the Secret Service break room, spare ammunition from Agent Clough's abandoned post. Clough, I wondered if he made it out with the evacuation convoy. By afternoon, the silence became oppressive. No helicopter rotors, no convoy engines, no radio chatter, just the occasional groan of settling debris and the whisper of wind through broken walls. I established a defensive position in the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, the bunker 3 levels down that somehow survived the blast. Emergency lighting cast everything in red shadows, making the familiar space feel alien. The first infected wandered into my sector around 1,400 hours. I heard shuffling footsteps in the corridor above. Slow and irregular, my training took over: identify the threat, assess capabilities, respond appropriately. I climbed the emergency stairs with my sidearm drawn. She wore a White House staff badge clipped to a torn blazer. Miriam Foster from Legislative Affairs. Half her face was caved in, probably from falling debris, but she moved with that horrible persistence I'd heard about in the classified briefings. Her remaining eye fixed on me with vacant hunger. No recognition, no humanity left. The shot echoed through the empty halls. Miriam crumpled beside a shattered painting of George Washington. I'd known her for 3 years, always smiled when she brought coffee to security briefings. Now she was just another casualty of whatever hell had consumed the world outside. That first night in the bunker, I maintained radio watch on all emergency frequencies. Protocol demanded hourly check-ins with command situation reports every 4 hours, extraction requests as needed. But the airwaves stayed dead except for distant automated emergency broadcasts warning people to stay indoors. I rationed my supplies carefully. 1 energy bar and half a bottle of water per day. The bunker's emergency stocks would last 2 weeks if rescue took longer than expected. Professional optimism kept me focused. They'd send a recovery team once the radiation levels dropped. The president would never abandon personnel in the field. Day 2 brought more infected. They seemed drawn to the White House ruins, stumbling through the destroyed rose garden and collapsed press room. Through careful observation from the bunker's emergency exit points, I watched them wander aimlessly among the debris. Some wore marine dress uniforms, others Secret Service suits. Recognition sent ice through my veins. Agent Guinea from the morning shift, Lieutenant Irvin from the White House military office, even Mrs. Query from the kitchen staff. They'd all been left behind too. The water ran brown by the second day, contaminated by whatever chemicals the blast had stirred up. I switched to bottled supplies, calculating consumption down to the ounce. The emergency rations tasted like cardboard, but hunger wasn't my biggest concern. Isolation was eating at me worse than radiation or infection. I'd spent 15 years protecting others, always part of a team, always connected to command structure. Now I sat alone in a bunker beneath the most important building in America, listening to the steady drip of radioactive water and the distant moans of the dead. By the end of day 2, reality crystallized with brutal clarity. No rescue convoy was coming, no helicopter extraction, no coded radio message with new orders. The government had written off Washington D.C. completely, and everyone still inside was considered acceptable losses. I stared at the emergency protocols mounted on the bunker wall, procedures I'd memorized years ago. None of them covered abandonment by your own command structure. None addressed the scenario where the very people you'd sworn to protect simply left you to die. My service weapon felt heavy in my hands as I cleaned it for the dozenth time. 15 rounds remaining in the magazine. 2 spare clips, enough to fight my way out if I chose to leave, or enough to avoid becoming one of those things shambling through the wreckage above. The choice crystallized as I watched dawn light filter down through the emergency shaft. Stay here and die slowly from radiation and starvation, or abandon my post and try to survive in whatever remained of America. Agent Nathan Benson had always followed orders. But Nathan Benson, the man, decided it was time to write his own. I sealed the bunker door behind me at 0600 hours on October 18th, leaving behind everything I'd sworn to protect. The radiation detector on my belt clicked steadily as I climbed toward ground level, but the readings stayed below critical. Survivable if I moved fast. The White House I emerged into bore no resemblance to the building I'd called home for 5 years. Walls had collapsed into mountains of debris. The famous columns lay cracked and scattered across what used to be the north portico. Everything was covered in grey ash that made footprints in the silence. But I was alive, I was armed, and I was finally ready to find out what remained of the country I'd spent my career defending. The morning air outside the White House tasted litin, metal and ash. I emerged from the emergency exit with my rifle slung across my chest, radiation detector clicking steadily against my belt. The sound reminded me of a gear counter from old war movies, except this was real. And the readings were climbing with every step I took away from the bunker's lead-lined walls. Lafayette Square stretched before me like the surface of an alien planet. The park, where tourists once fed pigeons, was now a crater filled with twisted metal and chunks of concrete. The statue of Andrew Jackson lay in pieces, the horse's bronze head jutting from a pile of radioactive debris at an impossible angle. Steam rose from puddles that glowed faintly green in the pale October sunlight. I'd walked this route 1,000 times during security sweeps. Now, I couldn't recognize a single landmark. The blast had been safely distant from the White House according to the emergency protocols, but distance is relative when you're talking about nuclear weapons. The shock wave had traveled through the city like God's own fist, leaving nothing untouched. Buildings that once stood 40 stories tall were now jagged teeth against the grey sky. Pennsylvania Avenue looked like a river of melted asphalt and twisted vehicles. Every step through this wasteland felt like walking through a graveyard of everything I had dedicated my life to protecting. The FBI building where I'd trained was a hollow shell, its windows blown out like dead eyes, staring at nothing. The Treasury building had partially collapsed, its neo-classical columns snapped like broken bones, currency scattered in the wind, $100 bills mixing with radioactive dust. Worthless paper in a world where money meant nothing. My first infected encounter came at the corner of 15th and 8th Street. Two of them, wearing what might have once been business suits, wandered between the skeletal remains of cars. Their movements had that distinctive shamble, but persistent like broken wind-up toys that refused to stop. One had lost most of his left arm, probably torn off during the initial chaos. The other's face was a mask of radiation burns and dried blood. The smell hit me before I saw them completely, a mixture of rotting meat, burned flesh, and something chemical I couldn't identify. These weren't fresh infections. They'd been wandering these streets for days, slowly decomposing in the radioactive environment. Their clothes hung in tatters, revealing skin that looked like melted plastic in some places, completely missing in others. I raised my rifle and took them down with 2 precise shots to the head. Clean kills, no wasted ammunition. The reports echoed through the empty streets, but no more infected appeared. That surprised me. During the classified briefings, we'd been told the zombie hordes moved in massive groups, drawn by noise and movement. Here, they seemed scattered and isolated. Maybe the radiation had thinned their numbers. Maybe the survivors, who could still think, had already fled the city. Either way, it worked in my favor. I continued north on 15th Street, stepping carefully around radioactive debris and pools of contaminated water. The silence was profound in a way that made my ears ring. No traffic sounds, no aircraft overhead, no distant voices or machinery, just the steady click of my radiation detector and the crunch of glass under my boots. Occasionally, a piece of building would shift and groan as the damaged structures continued their slow collapse. Every few blocks, I'd spot another lone infected stumbling through the ruins. An elderly woman in a hospital gown dragging an IV pole behind her like some grim parody of a dog walker. A businessman missing his lower jaw, his tie still perfectly knotted despite the fact that half his chest was gone. A child's bicycle lay abandoned next to what might have been a playground, its small frame twisted into an abstract sculpture of bent metal and melted plastic. Dispatch them became routine. Sight, picture, controlled breathing, squeeze the trigger, move on. My ammunition count dropped steadily. 14 rounds. 13, 12. Each shot was a small mercy, ending whatever remained of their torment. The morning progressed with agonizing slowness. Time felt distorted in this landscape of destruction, as if the nuclear blast had somehow broken the normal flow of minutes and hours. I found myself checking my watch constantly, surprised to discover that what felt like hours of walking had only been 30 minutes, or that what seemed like a brief rest had actually consumed an entire hour. By 1,000 hours, I reached the ruins of what had been the Department of Commerce building. The massive structure had panned. Its upper floors collapsed into the lower ones like a house of cards. Smoke still rose from somewhere deep in the wreckage, and the acrid smell made my eyes water. I circled the building carefully, noting the radiation readings spike whenever I got too close to certain areas. That's when I found the first signs of other survivors. Footprints in the ash, too fresh to be from before the blast. Boot prints heading east toward the capital. Multiple sets, maybe 3 or 4 people moving together. The tracks were several hours old, but in this dead city, even hours-old signs of life felt like discovering buried treasure. I followed the trail for 6 blocks, my hopes rising with each clear print in the radioactive dust. The tracks led through a landscape that looked like biblical prophecy made real. Rivers of glass where windows had melted and reformed, cars fused together into metal sculptures, street signs warped into illegible abstract art. The trail ended at a metro entrance where the underground stairs had collapsed, leaving only a crater filled with twisted metal and concrete. Whatever had happened to those survivors, they weren't going to be found easily. Maybe they'd descended into the tunnels and found another way out. Maybe they'd been caught in a secondary collapse. In this wasteland, speculation was pointless. By noon, I reached what used to be the Washington Monument. The 5-by-5-foot obelisk that had dominated the city skyline for over a century lay shattered across the National Mall like a fallen tree. Massive chunks of marble and granite were scattered for blocks, some pieces the size of cars. The pyramidion that had capped the monument was nowhere to be seen, probably vaporized in the initial blast. I stood there for a long time, staring at the ruins of something I'd seen every day for 15 years. The monument had been a symbol of American permanence, of things that endured beyond any individual life. Seeing it broken and scattered felt like watching the country itself die. The emotional impact hit me harder than I'd expected. This wasn't just stone and mortar, it was the physical embodiment of everything I'd sworn to protect. George Washington himself had inspired the creation of the Secret Service, the idea that some things were worth protecting at any cost. Now his monument lay in pieces, and the government he'd helped create had abandoned its own capital. I sat down on a chunk of marble that had once been part of the monument's base. The stone still warm from absorbed radiation. My hands shook as I pulled out my water bottle. Not from fear, but from a grief so profound it felt like physical illness. Everything I'd built my identity around, duty, service, protection of American institutions, lay in radioactive rubble around me. If they could destroy this, if they could reduce the capital of the United States to a wasteland, what hope did the rest of the nation have? Were New York and Los Angeles similarly devastated? Was there anything left of the America I'd sworn to protect? The infected found me while I was lost in those dark thoughts, 3 of them approaching from the direction of the Smithsonian. They moved with more coordination than the others I had encountered, almost like they were hunting together. One wore the tattered remains of a park ranger uniform. Another looked like a tourist with a camera still hanging around his neck. And the third was just a mess of burned flesh and exposed bone. The ranger moved with a limping gait that suggested a broken leg that had healed wrong. The tourist's camera swung back and forth as he walked, the lens cracked, but still catching occasional glints of sunlight. The burned one left a trail of ash and skin flakes as it moved, like a living cremation that refused to finish the job. I put them down efficiently, but not before noticing something that made my blood run cold. Fresh bite marks on the ranger's arm, still oozing dark blood. The infection was still spreading even in this radioactive wasteland. Somehow, some people had survived the blast only to succumb to the zombie plague in the days that followed. How many others were out there still human but trapped in this hellscape with no way out? How many had survived the nuclear strike only to face a slower, more horrible death? I pushed that thought aside and continued my survey of the capital. The silence was beginning to affect me psychologically. Human beings aren't designed for this level of isolation, this complete absence of normal life sounds. I found myself talking to myself just to hear a human voice narrating my movements and observations like I was filing a report to some phantom command structure. "Agent Benson proceeding east on Constitution Avenue," I muttered, my voice echoing off the broken facades of government buildings. "Multiple structural collapses observed. Radiation, levels elevated but manageable. Minimal infected activity, no signs of organized survivor groups." The sound of my own voice was both comforting and disturbing. It reminded me that I was still human, still thinking and speaking, but it also emphasized how alone I was in this dead city. The afternoon brought me through the ruins of the Smithsonian complex. The Natural History Museum was a gutted shell. Its famous rotunda collapsed inward like a punctured balloon. Through the gaps in the walls, I could see the scattered remains of exhibits, dinosaur bones mixed with display cases, meteorites scattered across floors covered in radioactive debris. The Air and Space Museum had fared even worse. The building was completely gone, reduced to a foundation and scattered chunks of concrete. The aircraft that had once hung from the ceiling were now twisted sculptures of metal and plastic. Some buried under tons of rubble, others thrown hundreds of yards from their original positions. I spent an hour searching through the wreckage, looking for anything useful. Found a working flashlight with a hand crank, a first aid kit that had been partially crushed but still contained some usable supplies, and a bottle of water that tested clean on my radiation detector. Small victories in a landscape of total loss. The Lincoln Memorial came into view around 1,400 hours, and what I saw there nearly broke what was left of my faith in American permanence. The massive marble structure had partially collapsed, its columns cracked and leaning at dangerous angles. The statue of Lincoln himself was still there, but his famous face was split down the middle by a jagged crack that made it look like he was weeping stone tears. The steps where Martin Luther King Jr. had delivered his "I Have a Dream" speech were buried under tons of rubble. The reflecting pool was a crater filled with radioactive sludge that bubbled like some primordial swamp. Everything that had made this place sacred to American ideals was destroyed or defiled. I climbed carefully up the damaged steps, my boots slipping on marble, made slick by some kind of chemical residue. The interior of the memorial was worse than the exterior. The ceiling had partially collapsed, filling the space with chunks of stone and twisted metal. Lincoln's statue was still recognizable, but barely. The famous seated figure now looked like it was being slowly crushed by the weight of the fallen building above it. I sat on a chunk of broken marble and ate one of my remaining energy bars, washing it down with warm water from my canteen. The radiation detector's clicking had become so constant that I barely noticed it anymore, like tinnitus from a lifetime of gunfire. According to the readings, I was absorbing a dangerous dose of radiation with every minute I spent in the open, but not immediately lethal. I had maybe a week before the exposure started seriously affecting my health, a week to find other survivors or a way out of the city, a week to discover if there was anything left worth saving. The emotional weight of the destruction was becoming harder to bear with each monument I encountered. These weren't just tourist attractions or pretty buildings, they were the physical manifestation of American values and history. Every cracked column and shattered statue felt like a personal loss, as if my own memories were being systematically destroyed. I tried to remember what the memorial had looked like before, but the devastation was so complete that it was hard to reconcile the ruins with my memories. It was like trying to remember a dream while wide awake. The images kept slipping away, replaced by the stark reality of radioactive rubble and twisted metal. The afternoon brought me to the Jefferson Memorial, or what remained of it. The rotunda had collapsed entirely, leaving only the outer column standing like broken teeth. Thomas Jefferson's bronze statue lay on its side in the tidal basin, half submerged in water that glowed with an unnatural phosphorescence. Schools of dead fish floated on the surface, their white bellies reflecting the grey sky. This was where the scope of the devastation really hit me. These weren't just buildings that had been destroyed, they were the physical embodiment of American history and ideals. Every monument, every memorial represented something we as a nation had chosen to remember and honor. Seeing them reduced to radioactive rubble felt like watching the country's memory being systematically erased. The water in the tidal basin lapped against the shore with a sound like whispered secrets. Small waves carried debris back and forth. Pieces of the memorial mixed with personal belongings, documents from government buildings, and things I didn't want to identify too closely. The smell was overwhelming, decay mixed with chemicals and something else that might have been ozone or might have been something worse. I found a spot upwind from the basin and sat down to rest, my legs aching from hours of walking through debris-filled streets. The silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat, my own breathing, even the faint electronic whine of my radiation detector's circuits. It was the silence of a dead world. And I was beginning to understand why isolation was considered a form of torture. For the first time since leaving the White House, I seriously considered the possibility that I might be the only person left alive in Washington, D.C. The thought was so overwhelming that I had to force myself to breathe slowly, to focus on immediate tasks rather than existential terror. Check ammunition. 13 rounds left, count supplies, 2 energy bars, half a bottle of water, basic first aid kit. Assess radiation exposure. Elevated but manageable for now. Plan next moves. Continue survey. Look for other survivors. Avoid unnecessary risks. The process of inventory and planning helped center me, brought me back from the edge of psychological collapse. This was what training was for, to provide structure and purpose when everything else fell apart. If the monuments were gone, if the Capitol was destroyed, if the government had fled and abandoned the very heart of the nation, then what did that make us? What was America without Washington, D.C.? I found my answer when I reached the Toic River as the sun began to set. The water level had dropped significantly, probably due to the blast effects, and the exposed riverbank was littered with debris from across the city. Chunks of the Washington Monument mixed with pieces of government buildings, personal belongings, and human remains in a grisly stew that stretched as far as I could see. The river itself was the color of old blood, stained by whatever chemicals had been released in the blast. Dead fish floated in massive numbers, creating a carpet of white bellies and vacant eyes that stretched from bank to bank. The smell was indescribable, like every horrible thing you could imagine, mixed together and left to rot in the sun. But there, floating among the wreckage, I spotted something that made me pause. A small American flag, probably torn from some government building, drifting slowly downstream. It was torn and stained, but the colors were still visible, red, white and blue against the grey contamination of everything else. That flag represented something the bombs couldn't destroy, an idea that existed beyond buildings and monuments, beyond any single city or government. America wasn't just Washington, D.C., wasn't just the federal buildings and marble statues. It was an idea that lived in the hearts of its people, and as long as people like me were still alive and still fighting, that idea would survive. I watched the flag until it disappeared around a bend in the river, carried away by currents that would eventually take it to the Chesapeake Bay and beyond. Maybe someone downstream would find it, someone who needed to be reminded that the idea of America was bigger than any single disaster. Across the river, I could see smoke rising from several locations in Virginia, not the black smoke of destruction, but the lighter gray of controlled fires, cook fires, maybe signal fires. Someone was alive over there, and they were organized enough to maintain fires. For the first time since awakening in the White House ruins, I felt something other than despair. Hope, maybe, or at least the possibility of hope. There were others out there, other Americans who had survived the apocalypse and were trying to rebuild something from the ashes. The sun was setting behind the ruins of the Lincoln Memorial, casting long shadows across the devastated landscape. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and I needed to find shelter for the night. The radiation detector's readings were higher here by the river, probably due to contaminated sediment that had washed down from the blast zone. I made my way back toward the city center, looking for a building that was intact enough to provide shelter, but damaged enough that I could enter without making too much noise. The search took longer than expected. Most structures were either completely collapsed or so badly damaged that they looked ready to fall at any moment. Finally, I found what I was looking for. A metro station near the memorial whose entrance was partially blocked by debris but still accessible. The underground tunnels would provide protection from radiation and wind, though I knew the smell would be challenging, and most subway systems had become death traps during the initial outbreak, filled with people trying to escape the chaos above ground. The descent into the station was like entering a tomb. My flashlight beam revealed a scene from a nightmare. Bodies scattered across the platform, some obviously torn apart by infected, others apparently trampled in the panic to escape. The air was thick with the smell of decay and something else. Something chemical that made my eyes water. At least 3 bodies lay in the tunnels, probably people who had tried to shelter here during the initial outbreak. They were too decomposed to determine cause of death, but the bite marks on the visible remains told the story clearly enough. This had been a place of desperate hope that became a killing ground. I found a spot near the station entrance where the air was slightly less toxic and set up my minimal camp, used my tactical flashlight sparingly to conserve the battery, eating a cold energy bar and taking careful sips of water to stretch my supplies. As I settled in for a cold, uncomfortable night on the concrete floor, I thought about everything I'd seen during my first day outside the White House. The destruction was complete and devastating, but it wasn't total. Life persisted in the most unlikely places. That flag in the river, the smoke across the PTOAC, my own stubborn refusal to give up and die. The radiation detector clicked steadily beside me as I tried to sleep, counting down the remaining time I had before the exposure became critical. But for the first time since the blast, I wasn't just counting down to my own death. I was counting down to when I'd need to find other people and start the long, difficult work of rebuilding the America that existed in our hearts and memories. Tomorrow I would continue exploring, continue mapping the extent of the devastation. But I would also start looking for signs of other survivors, other Americans who were too stubborn to let their country die without a fight. The monuments could be rebuilt, the government could be reformed. But the idea was eternal as long as people like me refused to let it die. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of bronze horses and cracked marble faces, of flags floating downstream toward an uncertain future, and of voices calling across a river that might carry either salvation or just more death. Dawn came grey and cold, filtering through the debris that partially blocked the metro entrance above me. I'd slept poorly, haunted by dreams of burning monuments and the constant clicking of my radiation detector. My body ached from sleeping on concrete, and the stale air in the tunnel had left my throat raw and scratchy. I packed my meager supplies and climbed back to street level, emerging into a world that looked even more desolate. In the morning light, the smoke I'd seen across the PTOAC the night before was still rising, thin columns that spoke of controlled fires rather than random destruction. Someone was definitely alive over there, maintaining those flames through the night. My plan was simple: cross into Virginia and make contact with whoever was generating those smoke signals. But first, I needed to find a way across the river. The bridges I could see from my position were either completely destroyed or so badly damaged that crossing them would be suicide. I headed northeast, following the riverbank and looking for any intact crossing point. The radiation readings were consistently high along the water, forcing me to stay well back from the contaminated shore. My detector's clicking had become so constant that I'd started to tune it out, which was dangerous, but necessary for my sanity. 3 hours of careful navigation through rubble-filled streets brought me to Wee. It remained of the Arlington Memorial Bridge. The structure was still standing, though one of its central spans had collapsed into the river below. The remaining sections looked precarious, but it might be possible to cross if I was very careful. That's when I heard the singing. It was faint at first, barely audible over the wind, whistling through broken buildings. A human voice, rough and slurred, carrying a tune I recognized. America the Beautiful. The sound was coming from somewhere ahead in the direction of what used to be Arlington. I followed the voice, my rifle ready but not raised. After days of complete silence, hearing another human being felt surreal, almost hallucinatory. The singing grew louder as I approached a cluster of damaged buildings that had once housed government offices. The melody was recognizable, but the voice was obviously drunk, words slurring together in a way that spoke of serious alcohol consumption. The source of the singing became clear when I rounded the corner of a partially collapsed fire station. A man in a stained fire captain's uniform sat on a pile of rubble, an empty bottle lying beside him, and another half-full bottle clutched in his hands. He was middle-aged, probably early 50s, with grey stubble and eyes that looked like they'd seen too much. "Purple Mountain Majesties," he sang, raising the bottle in a mock toast to the devastated skyline above the fruited plain. He noticed me approaching and stopped mid-verse, squinting in my direction with the careful focus of someone trying to appear more sober than they actually were. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, his voice carrying a slight southern accent. Another one still breathing. "You government?" I kept my rifle lowered, but ready. "Service Agent Nathan Benson." He laughed, a bitter sound that had no humor in it. "Secret Service, huh? Protecting and serving the hell out of this place, I see." He gestured broadly at the Ryu. "Inns around us. I'm Captain Milo, Knapp Arlington Fire Department. Or I was anyway. Don't think there's much of a department left to captain." "Are you injured?" I asked, noting the way he favored his left leg and the dark stains on his uniform that might have been blood. "Injured?" Milo took a long pull from his bottle. "Bull. Hell, son. And we're all injured. Some of us just haven't figured out how bad yet." He studied me with bloodshot eyes. "You're the first person I've seen in 3 days who isn't trying to eat my face off. Where'd you come from?" "White House bunker. Stayed behind when they evacuated the president." "Of course you did. Duty and honor and all that." His voice carried a bitterness that cut deeper than any insult. "And where's your precious government now? Where's the president you died to protect?" "Safe." "Hopefully that was the mission. Mission accomplished." Then Milo raised his bottle again. "Too bad about the rest of us, poor bastards they left behind." I sat down on a chunk of concrete, keeping some distance but showing I wasn't an immediate threat. "How long have you been here?" "Since the beginning. Day 1 of this whole nightmare." His voice got quieter, more focused. "Got the call about multiple structure fires across the district. Biological hazard, they said. We rolled out with 3 trucks and 12 men. He paused to take another drink, his hands shaking slightly. Found people eating each other in the streets. My boys tried to help, tried to rescue the survivors. What happened to your crew? Dead. All of them. The words came out flat, emotionless. Andre Pratt got pulled off the truck by a group of those things. They tore him apart while he was still screaming for help. Thomas McGee tried to save him, got bit on the arm, turned in less than an hour, and went after the rest of us. Milo's voice was steady, but I could see the tremor in his hands getting worse. By the time, the bombs fell, I was the only one left. Been sitting here drinking myself to death ever since. You're still alive, I pointed out. That has to count for something, does it? He looked at me with eyes that had given up hope. My wife called me during the outbreak, begged me to come home, said the kids were scared. I told her I had to finish my shift, had to help people. Duty first, right? His voice cracked slightly. Found their house yesterday. Nothing left but ash and bones. Kate, little Kristen and Aaron. All gone while Daddy was out playing hero. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the distant sound of wind through broken buildings. I understood his pain in a way that went beyond words. We'd both chosen duty over family, service over personal safety. I'm sorry, I said, and meant it. Sorry doesn't bring them back. He took another drink. Sorry doesn't rebuild the world. Maybe not, but giving up doesn't help either. Milo laughed bitterly. Help what? Look around you, Agent Benson. There's nothing left to help. There's you, there's me, there are those smoke signals across the river. Other people who haven't figured out it's over yet. I stood up, feeling a surge of frustration. It's not over. Not as long as people like us are still breathing. People like us? Milo struggled to his feet, swaying slightly. What kind of people are we exactly? The question hit harder than I had expected because I didn't have a good answer. We are the ones who don't quit, I said finally. We are the ones who keep going when everything falls apart. Keep going toward what? Milo demanded. What exactly are we supposed to keep going toward? Before I could answer, the sound of footsteps and low moaning interrupted us. 3 infected emerged from the ruins of a nearby building, but these were worse than any I'd encountered before. Severely mutilated, probably from the blast effects, but still moving. The first one had lost both arms below the elbows, but its leg muscles still functioned. It moved in a lurching hop, constantly off balance but never quite falling. The second dragged itself forward on its belly, both legs apparently severed at the knees, leaving a trail of dark fluid behind it. The third was the worst, burned so badly that its features were unrecognizable, skin hanging in charred strips but still moving forward. Shit, Milo muttered, dropping his bottle. Haven't seen any this bad before. I raised my rifle but hesitated. These things were so damaged it seemed almost cruel to call them threats. They moved slowly, their injuries preventing any kind of coordinated attack. But they kept coming, driven by whatever remained of their nervous systems. They don't stop, I said more to myself than to Milo. No matter how much damage they take, they just keep moving forward. The armless one reached us first. I put a round through its skull, dropping it instantly. The crawler took 2 more shots before it finally stopped moving. Persistent little bastards, Piedine, Milo said, but his voice had changed. Some of the drunken slur was gone. Even falling apart, they don't give up. No, I agreed, they don't. We stood there looking at the 3 corpses, and I could see something shifting in Milo's expression. The hopelessness was still there, but it was competing with something else. You know what's funny? Milo said after a long moment. These things, they're too stupid to know they should quit. They just keep moving because that's all they know how to do. Maybe that's not stupidity, I suggested. Maybe that's the most human thing about them. Milo looked at me sharply. What do you mean? I mean, maybe the answer isn't knowing when to quit. Maybe it's knowing when to keep going even when everything seems hopeless. He was quiet for a long time, staring at the bodies. When he spoke again, his voice was steadier. My boys didn't die because they were stupid. They died because they wouldn't quit trying to help people. That's right. And my family. They'd want me to keep going, wouldn't they? I nodded. That's what love means. It doesn't end when people die. Milo picked up his bottle, looked at it for a moment, then poured the remaining contents onto the ground. Damn waste of good whiskey, he said, but he was almost smiling. You ready to find those people across the river? Yeah, he said, straightening his shoulders. Yeah, I think I am, but first, let me grab my gear. If we're going to do this, we might as well do it right. He disappeared into the fire station and emerged a few minutes later with a canvas bag slung over his shoulder and a fire axe hanging from his belt. His movements were steadier, more purposeful. The transformation was remarkable from broken drunk to competent professional in a matter of minutes. Hydration packs, emergency medical supplies, rope, basic tools, he said, patting the bag. And this beauty, he hefted the axe. 30 years of firefighting, and this is still the most reliable tool I've ever owned. We made our way back toward the damaged bridge. Moving with caution, Milo's knowledge of the area was invaluable. He knew which buildings were structurally sound, which routes would minimize our radiation exposure. The bridge crossing was treacherous. The remaining spans creaked ominously under our weight, but Milo's experience with unstable structures proved crucial. Just like a house fire, he explained, as we carefully made our way across. You learn to read the signs, understand what's about to collapse. We were halfway across when we heard the sound that would change everything, a distant, rhythmic thumping growing louder by the second, helicopter rotors. We both looked up simultaneously, shading our eyes against the grey sky. At first, there was nothing. Then emerging from the low clouds like some miracle, we saw them. Dozens of helicopters flying in tight formation toward the ruins of Washington D.C. Military birds, Blackhawks, Chinooks, others I couldn't immediately identify. They flew with the precision of a coordinated operation, not the desperate improvisation of a last-ditch rescue attempt. Jesus Christ, Milo whispered. Look at them all. The formation was massive, easily 30 or 40 aircraft. As they passed overhead, I could see soldiers in full gear visible through the open doors of some helicopters. This wasn't an evacuation. This was an invasion, a reclamation. The helicopters continued toward the city center, maintaining their tight formation until they were lost behind the ruins of government buildings. The sound of their rotors echoed off the broken landscape for several minutes after they disappeared from view. Milo and I stood there on the damaged bridge, staring at the sky where the aircraft had vanished. The silence that followed was different from the oppressive quiet we'd grown accustomed to. This was the silence of anticipation, of possibility. They're coming back, Milo said, his voice filled with hope. Is filled. The government's coming back to reclaim the capital. I nodded, feeling something loosening in my chest. We weren't abandoned. They were just regrouping. All this time, and they were planning to come back. Milo's voice was stronger now. They're going to rebuild. We finished crossing the bridge in record time, energized by what we'd witnessed. The smoke signals had drawn us to a small encampment of survivors who'd seen the helicopters too, and the camp was buzzing with the excitement. That night, as we shared a meal around a controlled fire, Milo and I talked about what came next. The helicopters had changed everything. You know what I learned today? Milo said, poking at the fire. Sometimes the mission isn't about saving everyone. Sometimes it's just about saving whoever you can. That's what I've been trying to tell myself. I admitted that duty doesn't end when the government fails. It just changes into something better. Maybe something more personal. As I settled in to sleep under the open sky, surrounded by the quiet conversations of survivors planning for tomorrow, I realized that I'd found my answer. What kind of people were we? We were the kind who stayed behind to help others. Even when our own world was ending, we were the kind who chose hope over despair. We were Americans, and that meant something no bomb could destroy. Thank you so much for taking the time to listen to this story today. Hoping to see you all again very soon. Till then, sweet dreams.